Hello, Willow. Hello, network.
Let's share this point.
Okay. All right.
Excellent.
Thanks everyone for joining. I think we still have a few chairs left.
Yeah.
And great. So welcome to NECSI. For those who haven't been here before, you know, a lot of you have been here regularly. This is the Complex Systems Institute. And today we're joined by Zuckerman, who heads the Center for Civic Media at MIT, and thinks a lot about what it means to be an individual in a distributed society. And Erhardt Graeff, who's also been working on a lot of these things, and what it means to have continuous involvement in civics, not just every now and then, every few years. So,
thanks.
Take it away.
So, very happy to be here. And what I want to do is I'm going to talk for maybe 25, 30 minutes and sort of lay out some of the ideas that we're working on over at Center for Civic Media around this question of how civic participation is changing, and how the rules of civic participation may lead to some very complicated modeling problems, and sort of leave you with a complicated modeling problem that we are trying to work on. And then I'm going to hand over to my good friend, colleague, and incidentally my doctoral student, Erhardt Graeff, who has a workshop where we are hoping to break you guys up into small groups and ask you to think about modeling some of the problems that we are thinking about. And so the way that I wanted to introduce you to these problems is by asking you to think of yourself in a very different context, which is I would like you to think of yourself as someone with unlimited financial resources. And I realize for many people that may actually be a stretch, so I wanted to help you. So there is a Powerball draw tonight. The grand prize for this is $1.5 billion. So if things go particularly well, you too might be a billionaire. Now, at the same time, let me say that you are far more likely to be struck and killed by a meteorite than you are to become a billionaire based on this particular exercise. But it's nice to have that opportunity. And allow me to sort of let you share that imagination with me. Envision yourself as a billionaire. And now think about this question. Given essentially unlimited financial constraints, and we can argue about whether $1 billion really is enough to have unlimited financial constraints, what's the most effective way to change the world? Now, interestingly enough, you can actually look at people who are in this situation. And what's interesting about it is that they try very, very different ways to change the world. So David and Charles Koch, they've each got an awful lot of money, about 44 billion apiece. Their preferred method of change involves political campaigns and conservative think tanks. And they fund this amazing, complex network of organizations that funnel what people call dark money into various different political campaigns. They spent something like $400 million in the 2012 election. They're going to spend somewhere around $900 million in the upcoming election. But hey, it's not just conservatives. You can look at progressives as well. Here's George Soros. He's worth rather a lot of money. His preferred method of social change is funding an enormous family of progressive organizations, things like Human Rights Watch, but also things like the Drug Policy Alliance, which has been the leading actor for many, many years trying to get drugs of all sorts legalized within the United States. It doesn't necessarily have to be based around trying to pass laws. Bill Gates also has a little bit of money. His focus with that money, and now also with Warren Buffett's money, has been on funding research, and particularly academic research around issues focused on global health and particularly global education, and also trying to do a lot of work with sort of shaping perceptions of these issues That is him releasing what he claimed were malarial mosquitoes at the TED conference some years ago, to which Pierre Omidyar reacted by saying, "I'm no longer sitting in the front row ever again." You've got folks like Jeff Bezos, quite a bit of money. His theory of change around this has been to say maybe what we need is better information and better media. And so he's taken the legendary, but also legendarily loss-making Washington Post and given it new life and tried to figure out where it goes. Pierre Omidyar, when he's not swatting mosquitoes, has been starting First Look Media, trying to create his own way of making change that way. Elon Musk, new to this list, quite a bit of money. As we know, his preferred theory of change is building an invincible armored suit that allows him to fly and fend off, is to build an electric car company, as well as a space company that looks at ways in which technology allows us to do things in the world that we simply can't do right now. And his theory essentially says there's no possible way that we can give everybody the standard of living that they want and deserve with existing technology, so what we need is massive technological innovation. So my reason, my reason for outlining these different ways to change the world is not to suggest that one is particularly preferable over the other, or that when you win the Powerball tomorrow, that you should found a rocket company or buy a newspaper or so on and so forth. It's actually to make 2 points. And so the first point I'm going to make from actually a fairly well-informed point of view. Even if you are a multi-billionaire with strong desires to change the world, it's really, really hard to do. So my day job, I teach over at the Media Lab and run a group called the Center for Civic Media. The job that I moonlight as is advising George Soros on how to spend his philanthropic money. So I sit on the board of his foundation. I actually sit on a committee of 5 people that decides how we spend $900 million a year on progressive social causes. And let me be the first to admit that we suck at it. We are really, really bad at it. We have 1,600 incredibly hardworking people in 40 offices all around the world, and we lose something like 95% of the time. Now, we lose 95% of the time because we take on a lot of issues that are really hard. We really like people to stop persecuting the Roma people. That, has been a problem for a couple hundred years, probably will be a problem for another couple hundred years. But we're also really bad at it because it turns out that goodwill and money is absolutely insufficient to make major social change. And in fact, it's really hard to know how to make major social change. Even in cases where we have had a huge positive impact, and I would say drug policy in the United States is a place where we've been enormously successful. We funded a great deal of work in that space. We don't know whether it was something that we did or whether it was a cultural shift where people have changed attitudes on this, whether it was simply watching untold trillions of dollars go into the war on drugs and fail utterly. It's very hard for us to know how we would sort of claim success in this. So the first thing I'd like you to take away is even when you win the Powerball, it's going to be really, really hard to shape the universe to make fundamental social change. But the more important lesson that I want to get across is that when you look at these different billionaires taking on different theories of change, there's a lot of different ways to try to figure out how you would change them. And so looking at those billionaires that we just looked at, we had a technology-based theory of change. Maybe we can invent our way to a carbon-free future. We have a research-based theory of change. If we fund the best minds, maybe we'll figure out how to cure malaria. We have political-based theories of change. We have civil society-based theories of change. We have a lot of different ways to change the world. And what I want to suggest is that this same sort of calculus, this dilemma of, I've got a pile of money, where should I stand if I want to put in a lever and try to move the world, is actually what every individual as a citizen, even if you don't have $1 billion, should be thinking about. Because in some ways, you may actually have more flexibility to try to figure out how to change the world if you are not saddled with the billions of dollars and all the people wanting to get the billions of dollars from you. But the key lesson in this is sort of figuring out what are different ways that you could try and change them. So Erhardt and I teach civics, and civics is a terrible word. And one of the things that I would love to get out of talks like this is if someone can give me a better word for it. Because when you say civics, people immediately think of voting. They think, let's go out to the polling place, let's do our civic duty. People who think a little bit more broadly may also think, let's go out and march, let's go out and protest. But we really want to talk about civics in a much, much broader sense. That civics has to do with what you publish on social media, it has to do with what you buy and don't buy, it has to do with who you choose to talk to, how you commute to work. It's definitely built into the ideas of the personal and political, but it's really built into this notion that these legal-based theories of change, these theories that essentially say, let's elect the right person and they will change the world, or let us protest and be heard by the right person and then we will change the world, are a remarkably impoverished view of all of this. And there's reasons that we tend to believe this. We live in a remarkable nation that's been a remarkable experiment in governance, but we've hit a particularly dark moment in that nation. And that dark moment has a lot to do with a really understandable loss of faith in institutions. So I've started thinking of this as an age of mistrust. And you can see some of the symptoms of an age of mistrust. The people who are getting the most attention, the most visibility in this presidential campaign are people who are announcing to you that they're entirely outside of the political system. They don't like any of these people. They're complete outsiders. How Senator Sanders, who's been in elected office for the last 40 years, can be saying that, I don't entirely understand, but it's clearly the brand that he's marketing himself on. It's not a bad idea. If you ask people whether they think members of the following professions are trustworthy, you will find out that members of Congress come out lower than car salespeople, advertising execs, and lawyers. I don't really want to tell you where college professors come in on that list. It's lower than nurses. This is the graph that, for me, sort of helps me understand where we are at this moment, which is when you ask Americans, do you trust the government in Washington to do the right thing all or most of the time? 1964, this graph peaks at 77%. We've been downhill ever since. And recently, we've hit lows in the single digits. We're a little bit above that now. But this is a remarkable social shift. It's not a constant shift. There have been ups and downs within it. One thing that I would note is that the only time that I've been alive that more than 50% of people have said that they trusted the government in Washington to do the right thing is right before we invaded Iraq. So what the hell do we know? But one way or another, we don't have a lot of confidence in the folks in Washington to do the right thing or to make changes that we'd like to see in society. What's interesting is that we're not just losing trust in Congress and the executive, we're actually losing trust in institutions across the country. So when you look at these surveys that ask, do you trust big business? Do you trust nonprofits? Do you trust labor unions, organized religion, universities? Across the board, we have declines in trust in everything other than the military and in small business, which have become part of the mom and apple pie of contemporary America. It's not just us, by the way. Folks who are looking at this in Europe, the PR firm Edelman has been looking at this in Europe and also around the world. They see an erosion in trust, and it's not just a governmental trust, it's an institutional trust. Anything that is big and organized and is an established source of power, we seem less likely to believe in, we seem less likely to want to delegate authority to. Lots of reasons this could happen. We've had some malfeasance in government. Then we went through an era of people telling us that government could do nothing right, and then underfunding government so that government could, in fact, do nothing right. To be fair and nonpartisan about this, we've had malfeasance on other sides of the aisle as well. For me, I actually think in the US it has a lot more to do with seeing the limits of what government actually can do. And seeing that there have been natural disasters and tragedies where the government simply has not been up to making the sort of changes that we expect. I think for a lot of people who had faith that the unregulated markets, which of course are not unregulated, had a resilience that a centralized government didn't do. 2007, 2008 should definitely have shaken your confidence somewhat. I study media. I think the unfettered press, whether it's the press during Watergate or whether it's Ed Snowden, has had a lot to do with eroding this trust, sometimes in very helpful ways, but in ways that at the end of the road end up creating a really interesting crisis for civics. So here's the problem with civics. What we basically know how to do in traditional civics is to elect good people to office and ask them to make the changes that we want to see in society. And when we've elected those good people to office, to try to figure out how we pressure them. So we might call them, we might petition them, we might protest in the street and demand that they do something. But they're not doing anything. They're doing surprisingly little. And almost everyone can agree that this system at this point is not working as well as it could be, not as well as it has been historically. So the question becomes, if you're a citizen and you want to make change, what do? Signing up to be part of a presidential campaign may not work. And so here I find myself turning to my friend Larry Lessig. And Lessig wrote this very helpful book, 1999, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. Most people remember it for the phrase code is law, but I actually want to unpack what Larry's actually saying there, because you can do a trick called the inverted Lessig. I don't recommend doing it in mixed company, it's very awkward, but the inverted Lessig basically starts by saying Lessig believes that there are at least 4 ways that we regulate society. We pass laws and we say, if you do that, I'm going to arrest you. We make certain behaviors expensive and other behaviors cheap in markets. We have social norms. Hey, it is really undesirable for you to stand up in the middle of my talk and start singing Lady Gaga songs. It's just not done, it's outside of the social script, and we will socially sanction you for doing it. And maybe his key breakthrough was realizing that you can build certain technical architectures that make certain behaviors difficult and certain behaviors easy. When I put a CD, those things still exist, into my laptop wants to rip it and give me a local MP3 copy. When I put in the DVD, it absolutely refuses to do the same thing unless I have done lots of things to make it happen. So the inverted Lessig says, these are the ways that we regulate society. Our version of this says, these are great ways in which we could make social change. And we're used to making social change through law, but we could make social change in a lot of different ways. So social change through law, we can think about something like the Human Rights Campaign, which managed to get a victory at the Supreme Court for equal marriage after an enormous amount of legislative work behind the scenes. And let me not knock social change through law. Social change through law is awesome if you can pull it off. You end up with the entire government apparatus backing you up so that when a county clerk in Kentucky says, well, I'm not going to do it, everybody else says, yeah, you are. We're going to find a way to make that happen. Law is a great way to get very comprehensive change. But it's not the only way to get change. And at this particular moment in time, I think for a lot of average citizens, believing that you're going to get change through law is actually a very difficult sell. So let's talk about other ways to get change. When I think of things that I'm pissed off about, I'm pretty pissed off about the NSA. I spend most of my time working with activists in the developing world. I am on every conceivable watch list that you could be on by virtue of who I know and who I spend time with, and I have very good reason to suspect that most of my communication is being intercepted. I can't imagine anyone getting elected in 2016 who's going to change that circumstance. Not that they wouldn't necessarily want to change that circumstance, but under the current US political process, I simply can't conceive of it. I think the likelihood of one of you winning the Powerball in this room is significantly likelier than having that change through legislative apparatus. But, thank goodness, there are people of good faith out there thinking about technical systems, code-based systems, to make it significantly harder to eavesdrop and surveil in the ways that the NSA is currently doing. No, Tor is not going to solve everything, and Tor, certainly in its current underfunded state, isn't going to solve everything. But having people think about code-based solutions that try to make us more resilient towards surveillance is a very legitimate way to look for change around something like NSA surveillance that doesn't deal with a legal-based theory of change. I don't own a Tesla. I am not shilling for them. I have no stock in them. But I think they're a super smart hack at essentially saying, if you don't think the US is going to make significant progress around climate change, can you start using market-based forces as a way to make climate change? Can you build a car that not only has a lot of environmental benefits, but is probably the sexiest thing on the road right now? And is that a way in which you could transform the highly carbon-dependent U.S. economy in fashion? The stuff that Erhardt and I study the most tends to be norms-based social change. And I want to stand up here for norms for a moment. When you look at those sort of 4 regulatory frameworks, norms looks like the weak one. You're sort of like, norms, social sanction, what the hell does that matter? Weirdly enough, it matters an enormous amount. And some of the biggest changes that we've seen in American society over the last half century or so have been norms-based change. When you look at something like the Human Rights Campaign and gaining equal marriage, what's gone on at the same time is a massive change in social norms, where it is no longer acceptable to be a jerk to gay people. And that was a huge, huge normative step that in many ways made a legal sense. But for me right now, Black Lives Matter is probably the best demonstration of a norms-based campaign. And the reason for it is this: there's a lot of things that Black Lives Matter would like to do. They'd like some legislative changes. They would like more citizen involvement with oversight of police. They're fooling around with some code-based changes. It would be really nice to have body-worn cameras that work in particular ways, that give you evidence of certain encounters. But at the end of the day, it has been illegal for a really long time for police officers to shoot and kill unarmed people. So that's not a law-based change. But there is a norm that Black men are dangerous and threatening. And that norm has an enormous amount to do with how 14-year-old Tamir Rice gets shot for carrying a fake firearm. And that's really what this is about, is trying to figure out how you change those norms. And so you start seeing campaigns like this one. This was very early on in Black Lives Matter. This was a reaction to the ways in which Michael Brown was being portrayed in the media. And shortly after Michael Brown's death, that photo, all the way to the left, was the photo that most news organizations were using to portray Michael Brown. It was taken off of his Facebook feed. It's shot from below. His face is somewhat shadowed. He's scowling. He's making a peace sign. Most people report it as a gang sign. Because he's shot from below, he looks very, very tall, and he looks quite old. And so activists pointed out that in the same Facebook feed, frankly around the same time, was this photo. He looks pretty different in that photo. He looks like a sweet, shy, chubby kid. And this photo basically didn't get any press. And so what people started asking, starting with the group, was, if they gunned you down, what picture would they use? And the implication being, they would look on your Facebook feed, and if you were a person of color, they would find the photo that made you look the most criminal, the most thuggish, the most dangerous. And so you started seeing beautiful posts like this one from an active duty Marine essentially saying, I bet they're not going to show me in my dress whites. I bet they're going to show me in this other photo. Now, this was really interesting. People started latching onto this. There were tumblers around this. People started grabbing onto it. You can see in this one of the strange things that happened was that lots of white high school students thought it would be really fun to show themselves in their graduation cap and then drunk at a party. And so you had other people essentially saying, you guys are missing the point. Please get out of this hashtag. And within 3 days, the New York Times had run a story about it. And near as we can tell from our research, it's very hard to find that first photo of Michael Brown after this story. Basically, this was a way of saying to the US press, you have a surprising amount of influence over how we see the normative aspect of a case like Michael Brown. And your decision of which image to use coming off of Facebook actually has very complicated and subtle repercussions coming up. So the question that I want to ask now, and the question that I really want to ask you guys, is does any of this stuff work, and how would you know if it did, right? So I just gave you a small example of what in my space is considered a pretty successful campaign. You know, people found a good way to get people talking about it. You guys all get the point of it. Is that going to fix racism? And I actually mean that as a serious question. I don't mean that as a throwaway. Because what I would argue is that actually that's a small but potentially significant step in trying to figure out how you make a normative shift over time. A lot of what we do over in my lab is try to figure out how would you understand the influence of media-based campaigns? And so I just did an article recently with Anya Schifrin, who's down at Columbia Journalism School, around this question of how do you think about the impact of media? And we put together a very simple framework. It's the sort of framework that will piss off people in this room because it's actually very hard to model because there's a lot of squish in it. But I'm here in part to admit my squish and hope that you guys will help. We know that we can measure how far media goes. We can measure reach, right? We've had the whole online ad industry trying to figure this out, and there's all sorts of problems with fraud and inexactitude and so on and so forth. But we can make reasonably good guesses that this post got this many attention minutes and this post got that many attention minutes. We're fairly poor, but at least we have some thoughts on modeling impact. You have organizations like ProPublica that basically keep dossiers in the reporting that they do. And they look and they say, we put this out, this law got passed, this congressional hearing happened, here are the different things that we can trace for. The problem with that is that there are no single metrics because there's no single theory of change. Everyone's trying something different on different issues, they end up in different places. We've been thinking about this question of influence. And what I mean by influence is when you are trying to change the frame, right? So when Michael Brown gets shot, the first frame that people reach for is young black thug. And that's what comes out of that. You very quickly had activists come out with another frame, which was police violence and brutality. And then you had the police come back and say, correct arrest. We have photos of this guy robbing a convenience store and stealing cigars. And what you had around this are these warring frames. And a huge amount of what we do in norms-based activism is we try to figure out how we can shift the framing of issues. And then we try to see how that framing plays out over time. The main tool we use for this is something we've been developing for about 8 years. It's called Media Cloud. Probably the best way to think about Media Cloud is an open source LexisNexis that is open code, open information, and has some really interesting front-end visualization tools. We basically grab every story from about 50,000 news sources every day. That covers most mainstream US news. It covers about 20 different countries. We get a lot of blogs. We also have the capability of spidering and finding stuff in more detail. Sometimes what it lets us do is just sort of super simple analysis. So Sandra Bland was getting a lot of attention after she died in custody in Texas. And then Cecil Lyon got killed by a dentist in Zimbabwe. And we have no idea whether it's causal that people lost interest in Sandra Bland, but I can actually make a pretty convincing argument that Michael Jackson's death ended the Green Revolution, or at least international interest in Iran's Green Revolution. US media is remarkably mono-focused story-wise. It's very hard to keep 2 or 3 big stories going on at the same time. But sometimes we can get deeper stuff out of this. This is just a super simple analysis looking at coverage of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray, so looking at Ferguson, looking at Baltimore, and looking at when people talked about protests versus riots. So there were 2 main waves of activity in the streets in Ferguson, one immediately after Michael Brown's death, another after the failure to indict. And you'll see they mostly get called protests. They very rarely get called riots. After Freddie Gray's death in Baltimore, you had one wave of protest. What was different with this wave of protest is both the mayor of Baltimore and President Obama referred to the protesters as thugs. And what you can see in the media coverage is that it was mostly covered as a riot. Now that's really interesting. When you have people taking to the streets in anger, whether you call it a protest or a riot matters a lot in terms of the warring frame. So these can be really interesting, really powerful. We did a super quick, off-the-cuff, how much did we talk about Charlie Hebdo versus how did we talk about violence in northern Nigeria? And the public editor of the New York Times picked it up. And weirdly enough, the New York Times started writing more about Boko Haram in Nigeria after the fact. And I can feel good about that for a little bit. But the really powerful stuff that this can do is try to figure out what those frames are in a complex media landscape. So this is a visualization of English language media talking about Ebola in November 2014. And November 2014 is sort of the peak of the Ebola story. And as we look at this, you'll actually remember some of the history. This conversation up here in purple is a medical conversation. The way that we graph this is we've gone out into Media Cloud. We've grabbed about 50,000 articles that have matched for Ebola over that course of time. We've ranked the importance of those articles by looking at a couple of things. We're looking at inlinks into those articles. We're looking at their share on Facebook, how often they were spread around. We're looking at their share on social media, and we're using Bitly as a proxy for share. We are then finding the 100 sources that are responsible for the 1,000 or so most influential articles. We're then treating them as bags of words, and we're creating a connected graph for stories that have words in common. So basically, up here in this quadrant, we have the sources and the stories that are using medical language to talk about Ebola. Transmissions, fever, infectious, antibodies, etc., etc. We have a very small cluster in pink. It's sort of there and now off at the bottom of the screen. It really only has 2 news sources in it. It's got the US government and the government of Canada. And they're talking about Ebola as a public health crisis, something that's likely to happen again and again and again. How do we react to it? You've got a framework over here, which is really about relief. Who's talking about the effects on West Africa? As it turns out, the media sources that are involved with this, they're all UK or Ireland. Almost no US media sources show up talking about Africa. It's not really what we're talking about. US media sources like talking about Texas. And they start talking about this gentleman, Dr. Pham, who has returned from West Africa, infected with Ebola, isolated in a hospital in Dallas, and we're all going to die. And then we have the yellow conversation, which is very helpful, which is Ebola is Obama's crisis. He allowed it to come to the United States. Obama, 5 letters in the name. Ebola, 5 letters in the name. We're both from Africa. Make the connections, people. You got to understand where this is going on. And when you look at this, what's wonderful about this is if you flip the graph, you find that it's Obama's fault frame is coming out of the New York Times, Bloomberg, Time, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News, the LA Times, the Washington Post. Basically, you could not get more mainstream than that conversation. That's the dominant conversation of real time. Now, we were doing this work for the WHO. You'll note they're rather marginal in all of this. They're way up off there at the top of the screen. And the reason we think they're so marginal in all of this is that they don't end up ever talking about quarantines. The heart of this conversation is quarantine. Yeah. So we were never able to really sort of figure out what that was about. The sources in the blue conversation tend to be what I might call paranoid media. And you know, it's about war and perhaps bio-war and things like that. But yeah, the Daily Sheeple, Infowars.com. You know, community detection doesn't work all that well. What we're finding on these things is that we actually have to have experienced people parsing them. But what we are finding is that you can start reading these almost as a scorecard. And here's how I would suggest this, right? If you are the WHO, you benefit from the medical frame, the relief frame, and the Africa frame. That supports your causes. You really hate the Texas frame. Like the let's all worry, Ebola is going to kill us all, exactly what you're fighting against. And you're pretty unhappy with the US politics frame, the idea that the US story is an African story. So if you are a media activist for the WHO, and remember that's who we're serving, you could use a visualization like this to basically say, how do I win on these 3 columns and how do I minimize these columns? And that's a ton of the work that we're out doing right now. We're doing this for folks like Univision. We're trying to get people talking about things like youth incarceration. And what we're discovering, unfortunately, is that in a lot of these subjects, the dialogue is so sparse. There's so few people talking about something like juvenile incarceration that the people who end up being influential in these conversations are pretty marginal. One of the major players within this conversation is the National Organization of Victims of Juvenile Murderers. They are not exactly pro-justice reform. So if you're working on the progressive side of this issue, having them be one of your major media sources within this suggests that this is a place where you might benefit simply from putting more media out. But it's also showing us that the way that these subjects come up is sometimes when there's just one insane case. So if you see Texas truancy and crimes, it turns out that truancy is a criminal offense in Texas. You can be arrested for missing too much school. And if you are 17 or older, you can be put in adult prison for failing to pay your truancy offenses. And the crazed looks that you guys are all giving me are why this got attention. But this is one of the few things that's actually gotten people talking about what's going on. This is my last slide. You'll be grateful to hear, and so will I, because I'm losing my voice. We want to figure out this question. How do you measure the efficacy of these sort of norms-based theories of change? So if I'm the WHO and I'm trying to get people to see Ebola as a disease that's not going to be a personal threat, but something that's incredibly important for the future of Africa, how would I measure that? How would I figure out if we're going to do this? And how do we do this around other theories of change, right? We know a little bit about if our theory of change is elect the right people, we can look and see how we do, you know, on November 3rd in 2016. But if we're trying to change the world through norms, through markets, through code, how do we know if we're getting it? The question that Erhardt is particularly interested in, and is sort of the subject of his dissertation, is how would you teach this? If you buy my argument that civics is more than just getting people to vote, but is actually helping people figure out how they would have effective social change, how would you go about teaching this? And at the heart of this, for me, is when you win Powerball and when you decide what to do with your $1 billion, how do we help people feel effective? How do we help people feel like they can go off and make change? So, having raised those questions, now what we want to do is basically squeeze some answers out of you guys. And for that, I'm going to turn over to Erhardt. But while he sets up, I'm happy to take a question or two, with the thought being that the main discussion might be after we do this workshop exercise and we're eating pizza. But I'm happy to clarify. Or be violently disagree with that question.
So, my name is Arnon, and I come to a lot of these nice people, among other reasons. Every so often, the Economist publishes a list of countries in order of their ethical score. The U.S. is never really near the top. You've got Norway, Sweden, Iceland, and occasionally Canada or so on. Do you ever think about the reasons these things are so?
I need to look at that index. I'm not familiar with that particular ranking. Certainly, in terms of social aid, and particularly international aid, we know that the U.S. is not a particularly generous nation. It's quite generous in absolute terms. It's not particularly generous in proportional terms. The Scandinavian countries are in proportional terms. When we look at welfare systems, we've had a real struggle in the U.S. between the sort of you're on your own theory and the theory. It might be an interesting question to ask. The U.S. is a remarkably religious country for a developed nation. Is religion somehow counter to an ethical set? But I would need to know how that index was being set up.
My name is Jane, and my question was about that survey data about loss of trust. I was wondering if you dig down and look at individual responses, are you finding that people are, large chunks of people are mistrustful of all institutions, or are they more polarized in what institutions they trust? And maybe some of that is canceling each other out.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that there's patterns of institutions that people mistrust. Conservatives are a lot less likely to trust the Supreme Court than progressives. There's been some good research done on this internationally, mostly around the World Values Survey. Norris is probably the best work on this. Basically, like trust, social trust was a huge research topic in the 1980s. You had folks like Robert Putnam and Barry Malone, and social cohesion, and so on and so forth. A lot of folks did really good empirical work. And what they basically found was there's not a lot of support for Putnam's theory as empirical, right? So like people who are very involved with their communities and have lots of good social connection still mistrustful in many cases. There was some fun work done by Frank Fukuyama, who wrote a very good book on trust. His theory was that it was cultural. And if her friend sort of looked at that base, he's like, yeah, no. What trust actually seems to correlate to is government performance. When governments are doing well, and are getting reelected and have high degrees of satisfaction, there's high degrees of trust. When they slip performance-wise, social trust seems to go down. Not just in government, but actually broadly. So maybe we're going to move to dysfunctional trust in a second. But it's super complicated topic. And I actually want to hand up to Erhardt at this point because we want to promote you guys further, at which point we're happy to have conversations from here. But this is the moment in which you guys get to talk.
Yeah, and help us really think about this question. Quite honestly, that's what this workshop is all about. Because you know, the billionaire's dilemma is something that is very near to Ethan's actual work. You know, like he actually needs to address this problem, and so we're looking for other ways to think about the question of how do we make change in the world, and ask you all to kind of fill the shoes of the billionaire or their estate planners or program officers and help us address something like climate change. So climate change is a good one to start with because there is so much that is being done with it in different ways at different scales. And there are lots of different actors that are trying different approaches to do it, very creative ways. And they hit kind of all of the levers of change that we talked about, the law, norms, markets, and code approaches to addressing this issue. And so we're actually gonna have you split into groups, 4 teams to take on each of those levers. And so once we break into those teams, we'll be thinking about how do we develop a theory of change tied to our lever. So if it's law, how are we trying to put a new law in the books? How are we trying to change case law or whatever? What is our campaign that kind of matches that theory? How does that have a certain target attached to it, a certain set of strategies and tactics? And then we're going to ask you, after we kind of report back on our ideas from each of our groups, to think about how we might actually evaluate each of those campaigns. So this is where we actually start thinking about the modeling question. You know, what is it that we're actually measuring? How are we specifying, you know, the independent variable that we're really playing with in order to move the needle on that issue? And then what are some of the complications with trying to design a study around that? These are things that, you know, real, foundations struggle with every single day with regard to the money they disperse. And then finally, we'll have this discussion where you will play that billionaire, we will play that billionaire collectively and make a decision based on what we've talked about, how we might spend a prospective $100 million. So starting now, first 5 minutes, need you guys to break into 4 groups. My only criteria is that we have at least 1 quant in each group. I don't know what the composition of our community is here today, but I expect we'll have plenty to go around. So if we could just do this maybe by part of the room. So how many do we have here? 1, 2, 3, 25, great. So let's go with, just put 5 people here, 5 people here, 5 people here, 5 people here, equally distribute yourself across along the corners of this room, however you want to define those corners that you might know.
All right, and since these groups are not topical, I'm going to bring people online into this corner.
Excellent. Yeah, they're not topical, but they're going to be chosen by preferred levers of change.
Right. Good.
So some of you guys get to think about dorms. Some of you get to think about.
You guys want to be a part of this group down here? So, right there.
No problem.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And we recommend introducing yourself to each other.
Yes.
That's often a good way to start one group.
Yeah.
It would be 2 groups here.
There should be 2. There should be
How
4 total.
many people in a group? Let's put it that way.
So about 4 to 5. Yeah,
4 to 5.
4 to 6, roughly.
2, 4.
You guys got?
Very good.
What are we doing over here?
We actually need 4 groups. Are you guys
Hello.
2 groups or what?
Willow and
Hello.
online folks and people who are going to on no video while I'm eating dinner.
Two of you need to volunteer to come with us.
Sam.
All right, you guys. And you guys then need to make yourselves
That's Jay.
Yeah, hey.
And-
Very good.
Okay, right, yeah.
And we have 10 people watching online, including Willow.
Okay,
So
now we have
feel free to
orders.
type questions.
Great.
Actually,
Okay, so I'm gonna
feel free to voice
Right
yourself
before
in
you
chat
guys,
if you want, but otherwise, if you have the chat, you can type.
your
I
lever
think
of
I'm the
change.
only person
Alright.
on video as well, so we're going to
Just like
listen
right
in.
before
And if anyone
you
who's
go on,
joining us via the
I want
internet,
to start
Can't hear you.
I want to get you ready for the exercise. Okay, so once again, it's law, norms, code, and markets.
So
Those are
our
the
group
four
picks one primary
areas.
movie.
If you guys don't remember what those are, you can ask each other about those or ask us. We will be floating around as moderators throughout this this process. Is there any group that feels strongly about wanting to take a legal course of action? Okay, great. You guys got it. She volunteered you for law. You guys are law. Norms. Who wants to be norms? You got. We already give you Media Cloud as a tool here.
We'll do it.
We'll do norms.
Oh, I saw this hand first. Sorry. Norms are down on that end. Code. Who wants to do code? This is an interesting and tricky one.
Let's give it to SJ's group because I feel confident that SJ
All right,
can
all right.
answer questions
Conan, you
about
guys
how
got
marketing
markets.
defines code.
Got it? So that's going to be your approach. So go ahead, introduce yourselves to each other. I'm going to start a timer here for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I will give you updates when we get closer to the end of that time period.
Matthew, Jane,
Sam.
Sam.
The
Dave,
process
yeah.
here will
and
be you will have 10 minutes to figure out how to spend $10 million to address climate change using your theory of change. So how will you move that lever? What is going to be the target you take on? What is going to be your strategy, your tactic? Target meaning your audience. What are you actually going to be trying to convince to do something different? Pick a scope, which is very important. If you want to address something locally, $10 million can go a lot farther than if you try and do something nationally. And so think about how that scales your strategy. And then the goal is to have a 2-minute presentation at the end of this 10 minutes. Just kind of feedback to all of us here how you plan on go about that so we can talk about each of those things before we move on to the next stage.
Because I'm going to go to Mr. Soros and see if he wants to put $10 million for climate change. Which we don't work on an Open Society Foundation, but we could. You never know. So,
Any quick process questions before I let you loose?
Just like more of a content question.
Are we doing code?
Yes.
Is there a suggestion on the time scale?
On
Yeah.
how, see, that's a great question because that's going to be huge when we get to the question of evaluation.
and that's a
Right.
question that we're not going to answer
Yeah.
because
So-
it's a really good question.
So whatever you can do.
So the
with your
time scale is you
$10
have 10 minutes to figure out how you want to pitch us to spend $10 million using your leverage.
All right.
Quick question
I'm going to set the timer.
Our lever.
Start coming up with your theory of change.
Is it all right to think of code as basically a synonym for infrastructure in general? Or should we be thinking very specifically of computer coding?
It doesn't have to be specifically computer coding, but think of automated algorithmic processes that have been laid down and that aren't the subject of some kind of review. So yes, you can think of infrastructure in the sense that having an aqueduct means that a whole bunch of plumbing is cheap. Right? Not having it means there's local cities that commit to the
I think maybe the question I would ask you guys is, if we have $10 million, is stopping climate change the action we want to be taking, or maybe do we want to have some sort of adapt to climate change as a place to start, and maybe a more doable goal within the resources we have?
Well, stopping climate change is not doable no matter what, because climate's change regardless of human footprint.
Okay.
So
So what can we do? What's,
to modify,
yeah, what kind of code things? Like, do we just want to pop around the circle, maybe like things off the top of your head? Would you hire computer programmers? Would you think about?
I mean, if we only had 10 million,
Yeah, what can
or
you do with 10 million?
I don't know.
to
Okay,
shift?
I'll go first. I just was at the Bioneers in San Francisco. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I went and I attended Paul Hawken, his group. They have this new project called Drawdown, and basically what they do is they kind of more or less stack rank the top 100 areas of impact across a very wide spectrum of different things that might affect and change the overall the premise of drawing down the overall amount of carbon that gets put into the environment. It's called drawdown.org, I believe. But anyway, it turns out one of the ones very, very near the top is education for young girls. Why would you think it has anything to do with that? Well, it turns out that if you want to look at, there's a very direct proportionality between the number of children that are born and the education level of girls or women. The more education, the fewer children per family, which dramatically decreases the overall carrying, if we look at population growth as a substantial contribution, even as we decrease the amount per capita or per person that is utilized in terms of carbon, if you actually you have to look at population growth as a part of that. So anyway, they have this thing where they look at all this stuff and they kind of methodically try to rate all of them in terms of looking at, it's not just one thing. They say, let's take 100, let's take the top 100, and let's try really to focus on those. So I don't know. I think the answer is, rather than say like one or the other, it's more of a shotgun approach. It's like, in the sense of if it ends up happening, who cares what caused it? Let's just let's do it all and then some, right? Let's just do, pick the top 100 and then continue the next 1,000 and then just do it all, right? I mean, that's.
I say pick the most egregious and fixable things, such as the fact that a large yacht emits as much pollution is 20,000 or 30,000 cars. Why not find a way to measure this, which is partly code, to create instrumentation that somehow gives people, throws this back, and how the parking ticket says you were there at such and such a time.
So maybe have something that could set up an infrastructure or a coding thing that could draw on data that's already being generated and maybe just create a dashboard to show impact. Say someone does an intervention, is there a climate stat dashboard for like your local area or globally to show, hey, maybe we took all those ships crossing the ocean and we required them to update their engines. Did that change temperature? Did that change output?
Or how many actually complied with the law?
Or methane emissions?
Yeah.
Is this any other
to your point, I mean, I think someone said the top container ships, these big container ships that use this crude, they produce ridiculous amounts of particular sulfur, which, but in terms of, it's actually like the top 20 container ships is like more than all the cars in the world combined. It's like in terms of sulfur.
From an outboard motor that people zoom around on the Carbon Reservoir, fishing in this, which I've done, pristine water.
So visualization, and then finding a way to broadcast it back to people.
Having it easy.
So one example, I saw someone created like some sort of special filter when you report, or either like look sort of an overlay, some sort of augmented overlay or something that literally visualizes, allows you to see the pollution, the smog, like as it's coming out. I don't know if you saw that.
Have you guys ever seen there's a map that you can look at of the world that shows wind patterns?
Yes.
What if we had a smog or like an emissions map?
So that's kind of code. That's all the way. Also, by the way, that's code influencing norms, right? And that's sort of saying here's code that is providing the frame, how you really look at it, but the intention there is not. Is really to kind of change the norms as far as changing some sort of behavior. It's providing awareness that would, right?
Right.
So what, are there some deeper data things we could pull into this? Like maybe, yes, tracking emissions across the world, but also maybe public health instances of different kinds of cancer, or start pulling in if we think that, either change in how water or like I don't know if you're getting rising sea level, or think of the things that we would expect to be outputs of climate changes, things that would rouse, people to action of like, oh no, I don't want my part of the city to be especially unhealthy to live in, or my part of the country to be underwater. Like, what are the data points of things people care about that we could then just show on a map, and maybe they could add filters of like, all right, here's local emissions, here's all this stuff going on. Are there any interesting patterns or correlations?
I just want to interrupt here. It's a really fascinating kind of approach, and but it's very norms based.
Yeah.
It's very much about changing people's perceptions of
Yeah.
something. Whereas when Lessig talks about code, he often is talking about it as architecture, something that stops you from doing one thing or promotes doing something else. Nudge is one of those ways we can also think about this using behavioral economics to have you do something that you wouldn't otherwise do because that's how the physical structure is put in place. So that's how I would be thinking about your intervention is along those. How can we actually move people in a certain direction?
Well, when you get an LED bulb now, it says right on the package, you are saving X number of dollars in your electricity bill. And this
that's bridging
is limited to very few products.
Yeah. Right.
How about you are causing X amount of pollution with your electric lawnmower or whatever, or gasoline-powered hedge trimmer.
But to turn that into a physical aspect. So in that case, it isn't about knowing the pollution. It's about being affected by the pollution. So the code version of that, when let's say you actually experience the excess pollution by virtue of how your lawnmower is constructed.
That's how my lawnmower works,
That's how
actually.
your lawnmower works, right? Thus it disincentivizes your use of that structure because you're actually...
Well, like if your washing machine, if it, or any device really for that matter, if it starts, below, sort of exceeding a certain threshold as far as environmental friendliness, whether it's a, refrigerator or something, it'll just shut off or something like that.
So that's a great example. That is a great example. You can also think about it in terms of waste. Like there's all these ways that we can control the amount of something we use, right? So with laundry detergent, for instance, you can imagine having the thing that only allows you to have enough laundry detergent for what you're going to be washing, or in the case of actual laundry machines, they have efficiency settings that only allow you to use so much water if you use that. That's a perfect code base.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, so I never thought I would say this, but I think that this group is more concerned with consent than you need to be. Like, because we're thinking about, this group seems to be thinking more about shifting cultural norms, which involves getting people going on and then moving forward. Think about more the Silicon Valley, we're just gonna make people do it and care less about whether or not they're okay with it. I think that will shift this conversation to where it needs to be as far as code goes.
Yeah, the algorithm, the algorithm approach, if you're, if you're, thanks.
What's the difference between the washing machine and the market?
So if you convince the washing machine, if you make washing machine manufacturers implement a shut-off switch that won't let you use more than a certain amount of water per load, that's different than reminding the user how much water they're using, which they can.
Right.
So, are there
the washing machine makers would be the ones that
Yes. So the code changes tend to happen at the infrastructure or the tool level. It's something that's built into your interface or your device.
It's probably easier to measure effectiveness with code than some of these other things, because you'll get your getting and giving out actual numbers.
You can redesign your washing machine, but you can also do something simple like, what if with every thermostat control device that you send out, the default is set to a lower, the recommended program for running your heating is lower than our current norms.
Right, right.
Or, you know, maybe you distribute, if you're going
Yeah.
to program your house, maybe you say, here's what you can do to make sure you don't like rack up your energy bill while you're not in the house. Here's a free program you can use.
Yeah,
Well, the thing is, there are individual differences, and an ill, older, frail person might need a warmer house.
Well, that's where setting a default is then people can change.
Yeah, defaults are really powerful for
A
sure. Yeah.
default is like,
You put out the various data about yourself, your various conditions, and then come up with an index.
are there other things that people tend to waste without thinking that maybe change their behaviors by either doing the equivalent of having a toilet with two different kinds of flushes?
There is one already.
That's because other you guys have really come here.
Make a decision about what you're doing. You got 2 minutes.
Oh,
We
yeah,
got
yeah.
all this money just sloshing around like the Titanic about to sink. You gotta do something, pump it out.
Do we maybe
Yeah, no, I have been a few times, but I feel like that's like kind of I'm still sort of thinking. I guess I think we want to think much more towards like people versus kind of a different way of thinking. But I would maybe push to if we're thinking about changing behaviors like around ways to look beyond just like individual households and look at things like grocery stores or other yeah, looking at like are there I don't know, I'm just thinking of maybe one level up in terms of where a lot of thinking about like food waste and things to imagine both individual, you know, like families, individual who are making decisions. There's also yeah, a lot more waste is happening at on different levels, but I don't really know exactly how.
So yeah, so in terms of like, if I had to put my vote, it would be having some sort of number or index or some sort of rating mechanism for all of the, it's fairly standardized or can be normalized as much as possible, of the various different devices or products or anything that has any sort of output. Yeah, utilities or anything like that, and then you can basically see there's a common way to then see how many of those can be tagged to you. The budget.
So rating is still not code. A code function might be.
But you're right. But that would feed in. But
if we could figure out a price scheme, or if we could figure out if you were thinking about implementing a tax that only kicked in for devices that crossed the threshold.
Would that count as something?
That would count.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess we're realizing it's hard to do technology without.
I would make it so that all of these companies have to in some way, and like this is where the code thing factors in, but that they have to adhere to even more restrictive than what the guidelines that the COP just passed. Like, I think that targeting a consumer audience is laughable. We consume such a tiny fraction of anything. It's mostly the industries that produce the things that we then consume, and consume a tiny amount of things on top of that, that like make it so that a factory shuts down if they use more than X amount of energy. Like they're put in full stop if they hit that limit. I'm down for that.
I think we got the idea of some sort of kill switch. It seems like is
anybody ready to go first?
Yeah, I don't know.
Whatever you have right now, we're gonna workshop a little bit, okay? But whatever you have right now, let's hear it. Who wants to go first? Bold. Okay. Great. Team markets.
All right. So we talked about a lot of things. And we kind of started really focusing on local. We started focusing on the idea of supply chains and kind of supply chain sort of logistics, kind of the nuts and bolts of like moving things from A to B, as well as kind of like where is power generated? Is it generated over here and it's moved over here through what kind of infrastructure, or is it at the point of consumption, all these different things. And we kind of looked at the number 10 million And so that it's not actually a lot of money. So we would want to kind of bootstrap something within a local context. And we start talking about sort of trucking in particular, maybe converting a fleet to sort of greener energy sources. You were talking about natural gas. We could work towards fully electric fleets. And really the lever would be that we would be focusing on other sort of green businesses. So being the green supply chain for other organizations trying to create green energy and carbon sort of carbon negative or carbon sort of neutral market solutions. So really trying to be an amplifier, build capital, build supply chain networks, and really prove a model that would be local, that could be scaled up over time.
Okay, great. So thoughts on that particular case. I want to think about it in terms of like your target, your strategy, like what is your change here? So your target here is on supply chains of businesses, making sure that they have more green inputs into their processes, their businesses. Is that then you'd be supplying those things? You'd be making sure that that's being sourced responsibly. Give me a little bit more understanding of how that works.
Yeah. So.
Anybody in the team?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just look at, there are a couple of people who look at this from the way that they're looking at companies, Smith Electric, that started out making vehicles, and I think now more does like fleet management for people, and they just sort of say, look, greener can be cheaper, and we can maybe help you reduce your logistics cost, and so they're sort of a facilitator, and they partner with, they can stretch their dollars a little bit more by saying, you guys already have the right products, we'll cover the extra upfront cost of buying some of this a little more expensive.
Well, yeah. So I think you need to be more specific about that model, especially when we get to the next phase, which is going to be how do we evaluate your success in achieving that particular strategy. Other feedback for them, thoughts on how they could make this a little more specific, a little more concrete. Yeah.
You could have a campaign to put pressure on prominent businesses to be using a green supply chain and to report what kind of, like how much energy is being used by, getting all those supplies to do their business. If you're going to calculate a carbon tax, have the tax of the product made incorporate the supply chain aspects.
Yeah, I mean, your lever is really, when it's markets, it's to make things more or less expensive, right? And so it's maybe in the long term, the bet is it's going to be less expensive to do this green, right? And so that's how you're trying to sell it. So I would just focus in on that aspect of it. So when we kind of break to start doing that, make sure you can figure out what it is you're going to be measuring there. What is the thing you're changing in that environment? Next group, who wants to go?
So our lever was various versions of ambient visualization of the immediate impacts of the largest polluters or the largest sources of climate changing gases. And we were thinking about ways to implement code that would provide an immediate feedback loop for the people running those factories or those super tankers, and also somehow making that visualization available to other people who could then potentially work on building other bits of code in. Like this could be expensive. $10 million isn't a lot, so you can't implement all of the code changes that you want. But we're trying to think of a first step that would be a lever for other people. So we discussed the fact that the targets are probably a small number of targets. It's not really individual consumers who get a lot of the attention. It's really very, very big industry, really big shipping entities.
Utilities maybe even, and being able to, like, if you can show the data and then someone else does an intervention to maybe say reduce methane leaks in your gas pipelines, then you'd have a way to show that this actually has an effect in a way that's accessible.
So yeah, so points of entry for implementing the lever might be the utility lines. Any user of a utility that exceeds a certain threshold automatically triggers some kind of public record of what's being used, or really large engines might similarly automatically trigger logging of the amount of gases being emitted in a rough geolocation. It's hard, like anytime you do this, you have to worry about privacy and other issues, but those are the kinds of interventions we're discussing.
Okay, great. So there is these triggers with negative behaviors that they would want to avoid triggering, right?
Right.
Okay.
Which could involve laws also at some point.
Yeah, it's almost a little legal and a little social, and I know you guys were feeling that during your discussion.
To
pretty
automate
strongly.
it, I think, is part of the power, because then it becomes almost seems like it's objective in a way that maybe having one person go out and say, but I measured this one thing. Well, if you set up a system of measuring devices, if you have open source code for how it's being collected and processed and visualized, then it becomes maybe a source of like, oh, well, these are the facts. We're just working with what the facts are, and clearly this is polluting crazy.
So yeah, for the next phase, I would definitely think about zeroing in on what it is that's starting or stopping, that's able to happen or not happen because of this technological intervention you've created, in order to evaluate it as a kind of code theory of change. So just think about it from that framework. Who wants to go first? Law or norms? Who's next?
Okay, so we'll go next.
Law.
So law's tricky. So it's more difficult than it sounds. So I'll start there. So we talked about a number of different things, and this is what we kind of settled on. So far we represent. So basically, it's really difficult, I think, when you talk about laws to not kind of either become also some technological.
Laws are about norms, markets, or something.
And markets, yeah. So there's a very two different things. So what we were talking about was similar to some of the other groups really was talking about a big challenge around climate change is the need to modernize infrastructures. So we were talking about energy infrastructure, so like national grid for example, electricity. So we were talking, the assumption here, so there's some assumptions, is that at the moment, utilities are legally required to supply energy to households and businesses. That's an assumption. I think that's true. I don't know. Second is that it would be legally that citizens are not able to, or businesses are not able to collectively pool their electrical energy resources in a way that they're able to have greater bargaining power with utilities. So we're making that assumption that that's not possible. So what we were suggesting we would do is to pass a law that would make it required, utilities would be required to, as part of modernizing their energy infrastructure, have to work with, let's say, cities like neighborhoods or innovation areas or even regions, and those regions would be able to have a better guaranteed energy supply at guaranteed energy rates. So it's kind of market force and kind of and the tactic around that strategy or the tactic around that would be making it easier for citizens and businesses to work together.
Great. So you can think about that for the evaluation phase. You can think about that as the path toward. You can think about that as the path toward getting that law put in place or policies changed, and how you measure progress in getting that put in place. You can also measure it in terms of the quality of the legislation or policy and its outcomes. So think about those aspects of what it is you're putting on the table when you're trying to develop that evaluation. But that's a great one. Norms, last up before we move on to the next phase.
Yeah, when we think about norms, we're kind of thinking about kind of the scale at which you think about norms. So one is individual societal norms and how individuals act. And then also thinking about how countries act as a whole. So we kind of came up with two solutions. One is a grassroots solution, and one is more of a tongue-in-cheek global solution. So for the grassroots solution, the idea was to create an index for our consumption to create an index of how much we pollute in terms of consumption of unnatural energies and carbon and all those things. And then the idea is that we publicize that to everyone so that you can see how much you're contributing to the overall pollution, and then if you would change your actions, how much that would differ. So kind of like almost shaming you into thinking about changing your behavior if you aren't already behaving in an optimal way, but also kind of like looking at just individual action and grassroots action. And then for the global challenge, what we were thinking about was, well, if you look at how nations behave, there's resolutions in place that countries kind of come into to reduce their overall carbon consumption. And so the G has something recently that countries signed up to say that we would promise, to reduce our emissions by say 20% or 25% by year 2030. The problem is that the United States, India, and China, some of the biggest polluters in the world, did not sign a binding resolution, so they refused to be held to honor their conditions. So our solution was, why don't we just bribe the officials who are, bribe the representatives who are signing up on behalf of each country, and say that instead of saying we're going to sign a non-binding resolution, we'll sign a binding resolution. So we take the representative for the United States, the representative for China, and the representative for India. Those are specific people, right? That you actually, we know who they are, we know who they're signing on behalf of, and say, hey, we'll give you $2 million if you say you're going to commit your entire country's strategy to saying you're going to do a binding resolution and reduce your emissions. So that's our two solutions, grassroots and also macro.
Well, my first feedback is pick one. My second piece of feedback is don't pick the second one. And not just because you intended it as tongue in cheek, but also because it's hard to argue that that's a norms-based theory of change. Because it's probably more closely aligned as a market-based theory of change, because you've changed their incentive structure around what they're willing to.
Or actually, it's a classic law-based theory of change.
That's the other way I was going to say.
Laws are all about binding people to things they should do, even if they don't want to do them. Whereas norms is getting people to do what they now want to do because you changed what they want.
Yeah. So focus on the first one.
The economist might not make that difference.
Yeah, I'm not an economist. There's so many things that I'm not.
So now, next phase, another 10 minutes. This is how you're going to evaluate your success on this, right? So think about the campaign. Remember, this is why it's so important to be specific. Tell us, what are your dependent and independent variables here in terms of trying to suggest whether or not you've moved the needle. What other factors are important? Think about the other ways that that your issue or your strategy could be complicated by the context in which you're working, or by other forces working in parallel. Think about where you're going to get your data. Especially if you're working on a local level versus a national level, they might have very different qualities of data, and as well as quantities. And then, this goes back to that question that came up at the very beginning: how long until you can start making valid claims about this, right? Some of your changes might be immediate. Some of your campaigns, might take a long time to bear fruit. So start thinking about that as the way you think about your study. Once again, 2-minute presentation. Propose to us how you're going to evaluate your success. Go. We'll be floating around again to offer feedback.
Do you work at city level, like doing it in the city where you could actually account for a lot of the needs that are in that particular, there might be more information available to pilot to say this you could do this starting at a city
Or in
level.
one particular industry, such as coal mining. Whatever. At the mine and site, and also the.
I think coal mining is already well known to be a major polluter, so I'm not sure that necessarily identifies new targets. But if we look at, say, the New England region, and we're trying to do a pilot of, say, just measure methane and carbon dioxide emissions, and maybe one or two other things.
Such as the frequency of train disasters where thousands of
That's not
gallons
emissions. That's
produce emissions when they collide and burn.
That's true. But if we're setting up, say, just a monitoring system for emissions in the region, people have done this on the Boston scale.
what would we need to do to set up, like maybe we want to try and get within the geographic area just like one instrument per unit of area and then just start logging and see what happens. We want to, how much density do we need?
So what, one of the issues is if the actual target is to have embedded, to have a better kind of embedded logging inside, within your transmission network, it takes some time to do that. One of those solutions might be building an industry that ends up producing the most useful, fuel or other kind of grid, but that happens to have very convenient. For which this is a no cost toggle.
So, SJ, if I understand correctly at this point, you guys presented a solution based around distributed sensing.
Yes.
So at this point, the question really is, okay, we're going to do distributed sensing. How do we know if that's helping? And so the question there, I think it actually is really helpful, is to sort of say, well, what's our independent variable? Is our independent variable CO2 levels? Is it nitrous oxides levels? Is it sulfur dioxide levels, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And then when we think about, your other variables within there, what are we controlling for to try to figure out what our actual effect was within this? Because there's numerous other factors that are going to be going on at the same time as your deployment of sensors. So in many ways, this is experimental design. So if you're going to deploy this in New England, is there a parallel region that you check against where you're able to sort of look for isolation on this, or are you simply going to control other variables that you're sort of studying? But that's what we're looking for out of this. Is we want a multivariate model that helps us figure out whether you did something right or wrong.
Right. I mean, so. Is there an agreed upon already consensus as far as what's being measured? Is it parts per million of carbon in a particular region?
Yeah,
or,
I mean that won't be an issue. I mean, parts per million of carbon dioxide is pretty much when you see people running organizations like 350.org, their totally failed goal was to stop the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere so that it didn't cross 350 parts per million. That's a long time in the past now, but that is more or less one of the common standards. You don't necessarily have to grab that as a metric, but lots of existing metrics are out there.
In our case, it would be great to have a pollutant that doesn't disperse too quickly, so that we can actually observe the effects. You only have the money to sense it.
Well, you can pull out, in terms of the methane emissions, you can distinguish what's coming from, say, the gas network as like leaks from gas pipelines versus other types of emissions. And that's pretty, it does dissipate after time, but it's recognizable, and it's something you can compare to other cities or other places.
Right. So, I assume you've heard of social impact bonds. Yeah. So, I mean, basically the idea is like you would take something that has a particular cost. You more or less, this is not a great description, but you pretty much put up a bounty, more or less. You say this is an overall cost to, whether it's public health or something like that. And you say, okay, if we know that it is a very substantial cost to public health on an aggregate from a governmental standpoint, let's just say, we'll say, $10 million, $20 million is up for grabs. Anyone who feels as if they can sort of increase the odds that will go down measurably can sort of buy in and participate in that. So from that, because it's very hard, kind of centrally to go in and look in a decentralized way and look at all the different places inside a business. Each business producer, each producer is going to be the ones that understand their own business. They know who their suppliers are. They're going to be the ones that have visibility into what they are contributing to that. And if you start to quantify that, in some ways, I guess, I don't know. That's why I was kind of
Yeah,
asking,
so-
like, what would that
to
be?
me, that sounds like you're adding a layer of complexity to an already complex task, right? Which is, that sounds like a really good method to figure out how you would organize people with financial incentive to sort of work around this.
Right.
Where I'm trying to push you guys on is what is it that you're actually trying to do? So our friend over here is pushing us to reduce methane levels city by city. Methane's a good argument. It's a terrifying greenhouse gas. We spew surprising amounts of it, and fixing pipelines is a good way to go after it.
It's a good highlighter for, is this a well-modernized infrastructure?
Sure. So it's a nice measurable piece of it. If you wanted to go more general, you would go after, ppm of CO2. The trick is if you're just measuring in New England, New England's contribution to ppm of CO2 is sort of negligible, right? I mean, it's high, but it's a very small geographic area of the world, and that's really a global phenomenon. But I think figuring out what it is that you're going to measure, and then how you're going to model it so that you can figure out whether your intervention actually did anything, so that after you've spent the 10 million that you've spent, and you're going to come back to me for 100 million, I'm going to want definitive proof that your solution works.
But is that fair in some ways? I mean, I don't mean to get too meta about it, but I mean, part of it is, when you look at things like, I don't know, like, you read Peter Buffett, that his famous article that he said about, nonprofits, it should be the greatest risk capital. Basically, you do stuff for the aesthetic reasons. You don't really look at your ROI. You don't even care. You just know that you're doing something consciously. And at the end of the day, if you don't really know who gets credit for it and who does it, then why do you need?
So here's the problem.
Yeah.
You have to prioritize. So the place where I'm sitting, and therefore the way that we've sort of set up this exercise, is that $5 billion worth of ideas are going to come to me in any given year, and I can allocate about $900 million towards them. So somewhere at some point I have to do decision making on all of this. I could go random. I could go based on friendship and kinship networks. I could go based on aesthetics. I could go based on what I perceive to be the seriousness of the problems. And believe me, there are foundations that do all of those things.
Yeah.
What I want to suggest is that maybe there is an evidence-based way of looking at this where I say climate change is something I want to work on. How do we work on it? But your argument is one that actually is quite central to most nonprofits, and certainly a ton of what we do at OSF is around this idea that these are human rights. We don't compromise on them, even if we don't win, we're going to do it anyway. But for the purposes of this exercise,
I didn't mean to get up.
And now I'm going to stand up because
It's kind of like we're trying to figure out a minimum viable product. We go and test it. If it works well, we can get money.
and how we can go.
We have until
We have until 6. Pizza will come at 5:45.
Okay, great. Then I'm going to give people more time on this.
Good. Yeah, this is a good place for extra 5 minutes.
And there is, going back to what we're doing with this, there is this movement to have like these dashboards of statistics on a city level. Boston, Somerville, a couple other cities throughout the United States. If we set up, if our audits that we're putting out into the world is a local distributed sensor system and a way of incorporating the results into one of those established dashboards, that can be a way of either monitoring maybe
5 minutes, folks.
What?
monitoring, so it's a way of like automating and reporting to the local city government and to any citizen who wants to look at it, maybe just traffic emissions over time. And maybe the methane can be another version of that can be is your local system working well or not? But just to show, can this be done? Is this useful information? If we're getting carbon emissions that are the kind that come out of, say, cars, trucks, and whatever, that sort of thing. If the city was trying to do a push for like getting more people to use public transit, and we're seeing like this weather impacts on people are leaving their cars idling all over the place.
Right.
That's immediately useful and data people are interested in, and it would be a proof of concept that then it's like, hey, if it works there, every city will want it because their citizens.
What's your strategy for
Oh, you've got all this other stuff. Can't fly people anymore like Boston.
Boston's ahead of competitors.
I think we need something that's more so you can localize better.
Okay.
I think we need something that you can localize to a factory cluster. And then you could choose which factory clusters you measure this way. That's an easy way to compare.
Okay.
And
Ooh, like, is this factory actually controlling their emissions well, or are they doing a crappy job of it?
Or you could focus on the area near the factory, so you're not targeting them, you're really taking the pulse of where are the hot zones in a community. If they're near the factory, same as like on Cape Cod, they found toxins in the soil. They figured out that it was a plume coming from an Air Force base. And then they did, studies came up that there was an increase in lung cancer on that part of the Cape, although that doesn't necessarily prove it's from the toxins.
So it sounds like, are we focusing just on air pollutants for our initial proof of concept?
I would pick one pollutant.
Yeah, one pollutant, probably.
One pollutant where you don't expect too much noise from consumers, actually.
The gas company is measuring gas leaks. I don't know how.
Yes, but they're not reporting it to us.
There is some information out there, but you have to ferret it out. Yeah.
And I think your pitch of going to the city is not if the code piece is you say to the city, here's a roughly turnkey sensor network. Try implementing it in this way. It will give you these levers.
Right.
And you can do a first pass and figure out where the hotspots are, and then increase the density of sensors around the hotspot.
Yeah. Like, even just figuring out where are cars idling in the city, can you change
It's
the
like,
pattern of traffic
it's
lights?
like the U-boat strategy of wolf packs. You send the U-boats where the problem is.
Exactly. So maybe you get a finer route of information.
We could wear wolf.
2 minutes.
Okay. So are there any founders or things? So, maybe we want to also just be recording locally temperature, winds, things that would push stuff around.
We could pick one of the. There are some nice sensor kits. There's even a group around here that makes sensor kits that just measure a bunch of regular environment.
Yeah.
So that could be part of the package.
Yeah.
So for the independent dependent variable, you have maybe two cities, two factories, something like that. You monitor one and provide the data to the city or whatever. They're the one you monitor it, but no one sees the data except for you.
Right.
Does it actually change?
I like that very much.
But our money is limited, so here's an idea to set aside some to set up contests and grants in schools to come up with, their own ideas about coding, instrumentation, and measurement.
So if this proves like, and I think we don't have a lot of money, so if we set up an initial thing, there's definitely spin-offs of this, where we could have $1 million set aside for, can anyone figure out a better way to do this than the initial teams work with?
Right, that sounds like you both have good implementation ideas for how to get more funding, or how to stretch. But this sounds like two cities, two factories.
Don't report to one government and provide a dashboard to the other and see just within a year maybe what happens. Are there specific actions made working, trying to intervene?
Anybody need more time?
And also,
maybe.
Would anybody like more time?
Yeah. Okay.
Give us a minute.
Everybody, a minute? Maybe 5 to finish in 5
And so report back to the city and also report publicly,
Have it available.
Public.
Now, you can be in Manhattan and all this pollution is coming over from New Jersey or whatever. And they often have these kind of little tips.
Well, that's maybe where some of the wind tracking.
Wind tracking.
It'll point to.
This could get into, multiple finger pointing.
Yeah. In fact, so there is good software that does the wind and result tracking. So you can figure out for a given region what's the average wind force, and then we can distribute the sensor net along the card.
Yeah, and this might. Oh, I like that.
And if it gets,
And that's actually, you could give the information to the downwind city.
I was just thinking that
if
actually.
things
Yeah.
get bad, you could get Governor Christie to close the bridges down.
Yeah.
We have far less
Close the
pollution.
airways.
I think an non-driving day would be great. You know, just
So
on
just out of curiosity, like
that's, I guess, illegal.
just for fun, just a survey. How much? Because I do a lot. I'm a cyclist. I do a lot. You know, how much would you need to be paid on a per monthly basis to ride your bike everywhere, inclement weather and all? Just throw out a number. To just bike everywhere.
And never drive and never take the subway.
Subway's okay, but just not drive, or at least on a commute. Sorry, at least for the major commute. What would be the dollar amount?
It wouldn't just be dollars, that's the thing. Like if someone offered me both compensation and like they promised, gave me like access to bike stores and gave me saddlebags for my bike.
All included. So just factor
Like,
that
time to
cost.
go research this, you
Factor that cost in. You just that would be on a monthly basis. You cover the cost, but just to bike.
wouldn't do it in winter though.
You still wouldn't. Okay, so there's no amount in
Unless you
winter.
had underground tunnels for me to bike in.
Okay.
So I
What?
suppose-
Okay. All right. So there's no amount.
I walk everywhere.
You walk
no matter
everywhere.
what.
Yeah, I actually pay out money to use the public transportation.
All right. Interesting.
I went to one of those 350 meetings, and the first thing they asked was everyone who got here through public transportation or without
Or walking or without a car.
and the great majority either lied or they did actually come.
I just think it's just very interesting to see like how raw money sometimes, like if you were to say, okay, well, how could you just use raw economic incentives to change behavior, and like what are those thresholds?
Now, any volunteers who wanna go first on this? Folks, ready? Who wants to go first?
Nobody.
We'll do it.
We'll do it.
Great. So remind us of what it is that you're doing, what's your intervention, and tell us how are you going to measure its success.
All right. Our lever is code. Our intervention is coming up with a distributed sensing platform and then having a reporting structure for it. And particularly what we would do is we'd pick maybe 2 clusters of cities and we'd set up this sensing platform in both clusters. And in one cluster, we would also offer the reporting platform and see if having that available to the local city governments and to the local citizens, seeing if that will change behavior and spark initiatives that will try and see if, I think we were going with carbon emissions just to tie it to something that very specifically could look at traffic patterns and, are there cars idling everywhere? If someone had a public transit initiative, did this impact emissions in these areas? We'd also use sensor packages that would be collecting data about other potentially confounding variables like wind and temperature and so forth. And at the end of the year, we'd go and compare these to like the outcomes at the end of the year, maybe at the end of 5 years, and see what happens over time and whether providing this kind of automated feedback is something that then cities would want to be incorporating into their general governance dashboards as a worthwhile metric.
So help us understand, like, what is it specifically that you're measuring? What are we getting more of or less of?
So we're measuring carbon emissions of the kind that you would see from cars or trucks, and maybe other polluting things if you're warning them.
Methane.
Yeah, it's how much we could cram into that sensory package is a really good question.
Are certain of those more important than others for your goals?
I think it would be because carbon emissions are or greenhouse gas emissions, I think maybe is the better bundle to be using here, because that's
already a well-publicized term from the recent summit as something that cities and states are actively trying to reduce. They're trying to meet these metrics, or meet these goals of reducing what their area is doing. I think just providing a way of figuring out literally, are we reducing anything, and getting data, and does providing that data in a thorough, systematic, and accessible way change what the initiatives are.
And if we can find gases that have a small number of point sources,
Yeah.
then it's easier to localize and figure out. You could see, have there been changes from any of the point sources in addition to a change for the city as a whole?
So it's definitely a code-based theory of change in that you're adding a novel technical architecture that didn't exist before. That architecture is providing you with something that's missing from the current equation, which is a particular set of information. And that particular set of information is hour to hour, day to day, what do the emissions look like. You're setting up a classic A/B test to see if having that information will change behavior. I don't know that you're going to get City B to instrument itself and not look at the data, but put that aside for the moment. One thing that could go very well with this is you could end up saying, this is great. With $5 million worth of sensors, adding this piece of information got us to make massive change on the citywide behavior because we knew we wanted to change these things. Let's roll this out elsewhere. The danger with this is that you see negligible change between A and B. And that could happen for a bunch of reasons. It may turn out that it's surprisingly hard to reduce emissions on a citywide level. It may turn out that information is not the key missing variable in deciding whether a city does this or not. Your final challenge in this is going to be, even if City A does decrease, are you going to get the credit for this from this intervention? Because what may happen is City A's visionary mayor came up with an entirely independent of you plan that had nothing to do with your measurement, but had to do with her idea for flying bicycles, which turned out to really take off and radically reduce pollution.
In fact, it was Arrhenius right around the turn of the century who proved statistically that what he called carbonic acid would in fact cause environmental warming. But he said that this was a fantastically good thing, because it would stave off the next ice age.
I think really, even though we're setting it up as this cluster of cities A and cluster of cities B, probably our real metric of success is, do cities come to us asking for this sensory package to implement it? So we've got more than one way to get to success.
And we're choosing the cluster of cities by first looking at the wind patterns over the course of the year and choosing the downwind stream.
But thank you for your pitch. We have other people. Any other feedback for Team Code? Lots of feedback for Team Code. Great. Let's give them a round of applause. Who's next? All right, Team Law.
Great. So to remind you, we were looking at fair changes using the law to impact climate change. And what we were looking to do was to try to create a more flexible, modernized energy infrastructure through the creation of basically microgrids that would support community. So what we were talking about doing was then passing legislation that would make it require utilities to support these microgrids, also make it possible for citizens and businesses to be able to pool their resources in this way, and at the same time to legally require both sides to work together to modernize the energy infrastructure. So the goals here would be for the utilities to build microgrids, modern energy network infrastructural networks, and also reduce energy use. So the benefits here, what we'd be looking to measure would be reduction in energy use individually and at scale, that we would get same or better quality of service, improved compliance, improved energy resiliency for the creation of microgrids, and also the other piece of the legislation would be that there would be fines or loss of tax breaks if the utilities don't adopt these changes. So what we would require, the legislation would be require information of sufficient quality. So a big challenge would be to ensure that both utilities and also businesses were supplying data that was of appropriate quality, that was able to measure changes. We'd also be looking to require adoption of this strategy, and that it would be part of a regional or citywide resilience or 2020 plan that would be part of some kind of strategic long-term plan. So the way we would measure it specifically would be at a yearly level, would be, measuring that appropriate data had been reported, that there's a reduction in power demands, both at the utility level, but also at the community or individual level, reduction in power cost fluctuations. I'm kind of making that up as well, but that, that there would be fewer dramatic fluctuations in energy costs year over year over a period of time. And then looking at a longer term at a 5, 10, or 15 years, something like that scale would be looking at the degree that a resilient microgrid had in fact been created in a particular city or region. So I don't know how one would measure that precisely, except maybe by tests or checking that that's kind of emergency testing.
So great, complex, quite honestly. I think it's interesting that you started off by starting to hint at the ways that you would try and make the data pipelines to use that you would use to get data to measure the efficacy part of the law and policy change originally. And so through the fact that you get to be the theory of legal change, you could be like, well, you guys got to give us the data we need to evaluate you. Now you're still relying on the businesses to give that in some cases, but that was a kind of clever way that you built that into your approach. Now, I'm curious.
Lots of challenges, in case you're curious about that.
Now, I'm curious. Now, are you talking specifically about a local area in this case, or are we talking about? Are all of these localized changes, or are some of these national reviews of budget? I think yes.
I mean, I would think of it as a proof of concept. The notion would be that it would be operating at a regional level. So let's say, again, making this up, Northeast Corridor, or it could be, Silicon Valley area, any area that you would want it to be able to have some greater cohesiveness around sort of the energy that it was creating and the energy that it was using, and then also have a level of, part of what's important when you think about climate change is that you're creating improving energy resilience. So in other words, that you have some flexibility if a piece part were to go down or something.
3 observations.
Yeah.
One thing I really liked in the conversation that you were having, the dumb way to evaluate legal-based theories of change is whether you pass the law that you want to pass. And so there's actually sort of 2 things that you have to do instead. The first thing you have to do is sort of say, it's not just that we passed a law, it's that the law has the following characteristics. And usually when you're doing legal advocacy, you have a wish list. You have this sort of list of these are components of the law that I like. You never get them all. And whether you get some of them and which ones you get, that's often how you want to evaluate success. Much more important is that you're not actually talking about scoring based on we passed a law. You're scoring based on was that law enforced, how did people comply with it? And that turns out to be the biggest problem with a legal-based theory of change is that you can pass whatever law you want, but if you can't get people to enforce it, or if it turns out to be unenforceable, you did nothing. And in fact, you can pat yourself on your back all you want.
You've actually increased mistrust in government.
That's right. and that happens a lot.
You contribute to the entropy.
And even more corrosive with that. So the fact that you're looking at this and that you're sort of mandating data collection within this leads to sort of a second observation, which is that these theories of change are almost always interdependent. And yeah, it's a law-based theory of change, but it probably has a code aspect, and that you're going to need to find a way to get better measurement of all of this. It almost certainly has a market aspect, and that you're giving some benefits and penalties associated with it. Third, and this is just a general philanthropist observation, everyone does pilots. And on the one hand, pilots are smart because you get to figure out whether it works or not. But the assumption behind a pilot is this is so great, and it will be so obvious that everybody should do this, that it will immediately then replicate itself throughout the United States. And that never happens. And I don't know why it never happens, but it almost never happens. And it's usually because the amount of money required to get a pilot up and going tends to be a cost that makes it actually very hard to replicate. Yes, we would replicate, but only if we had a $10 million in starting cost on top of it. So that isn't a specific critique to you guys, but it is really interesting to see as people try to play with that $10 million constraint, you almost always end up in pilot land. And pilot land is a surprisingly limited place to be.
Should we just go right next door? Here
Sure.
Markets? Team Markets.
Right. We're running a pilot. So we were a little all over the place last time. Then Erhardt came by and he suggested bicycles. Bicycles for deliveries. So we kind of ran with that. So we will deliver your packages from one place to another greener and faster than the competition. And so, you know, that could be bikes, that could be drones, that could be like Tesla Ubers. Never really specified that. But so just going down this list of questions, in terms of campaign evaluation, we identified a number of variables there. Mind share, market penetration, miles driven, and efficiency versus the competitions, overall industry impact in terms of market share and efficiency. And then, you know, revenue and reinvestment in green, reinvestment in, you know, our own business in green infrastructure, etc. In terms of the variables, our dependent variable is the industry versus the competition, but also the industry-wide efficiency as we gain market share and possibly as our competitors adopt greener practices. The independent variable, basically customer choice for market share itself. Where will we get the data? Really, industry sources for logistics would be the primary way we would kind of source data to evaluate against. In terms of length to making a valid claim, we went sort of small and big. Can we do it in 3 months? Is it a year? I think we kind of settle on 1 to 3 years. We can kind of you know, prove the model, show efficiency, show that we can be revenue positive within a shorter period of time, but really showing the impact on the overall market, the overall industry, would probably take a much larger period of time, especially, you know, in terms of being able to show growth of our company and revenues and market share. That would really influence our ability to impact the market. So 1 to 3 years.
Great. So it's a really nice example of a market-based solution. So you're basically trying to create an attractive product that's going to compete in the marketplace. If the product succeeds, you also have some of the benefits that you want to have coming off of it. The really nice thing about market-based solutions is that when they work, they are almost forced to scale, which is to say if it's going to work as a business, it's going to have to scale in one fashion or another, so you sort of forced to think about it from early on. Interestingly enough, within this, you have a norms-based change embedded in a market-based change, which is for your business to succeed, people are going to have to decide that green movement of packages and goods is more important than the cheapest possible movement of packages or goods. So unless you can somehow demonstrate that delivery of packages by bicycle is not only greener but also cheaper, in which case you just got a killer business, go ahead and do it. You're otherwise playing with a trade-off where you're basically sort of saying, I'm going to ask you to do the right thing and do the green thing rather than doing, and that's a norms-based change. That's something along the lines of getting people to carry the recyclable shopping bag, right? It's a pain in the ass, it costs a little bit of money as opposed to the free shopping bag, but it has the benefit over time. What is nice about market-based solutions is that they are highly measurable, and you should be able to measure it in terms of whether the business itself is succeeding. You should also be able to measure in terms of what's your market share and how that's changing the overall picture with all of it. The challenge, of course, is that something like 99% of startups fail. This will almost certainly fail. And then the question is, you know, is it my job as a philanthropist to be providing you with risk capital to start up something that you should be grabbing out of the venture capital market if this is a really good idea in the first place? That said, I think one of the best experiments in the space has been Zipcar. which I think has absolutely not only been a market success, but has been a norms-based success in trying to change the culture around vehicle ownership and making the case that actually individuals owning vehicles actually doesn't make a ton of sense if you're an urban dweller. So, nice stuff.
So everybody wants to change norms, but let's hear from Team Norms and how they're working on their intervention.
Okay, so ours was developing an individual-based carbon emissions score shown through some sort of Facebook function or app function where everyone else can see it through some sort of score or color spectrum or something like that, and gathered from data, consumer data, where we're somehow assessing different purchases get different, carbon scores. Pull from, utility bills, how much energy are you using, or the tax records, what sort of mileage reimbursements are you asking for, how much driving are you doing, what kind of car you have, things like that. And building into this app is trying to change, the norms. So asking, maybe having part of it being when you're making a purchase, you put in what you want to do, and it's giving you suggestions as this would have a lower, carbon score. So maybe you should go with this one, that type of thing. And it would be easily measured. You could see how your score changes over time and how the total community's average score, cumulative scores.
So you described, kind of described it almost as in terms of a code-based theory of change, in terms of changing people's behavior by virtue of keeping track of this index over time. But if we're talking about it as a norms-based theory of change, what you want to measure is how do people's perception of the issue change? How do they actually think differently about this? So do you have a specific way of evaluating the success?
Yeah,
from that perspective?
Well, basically, the average individual doesn't really have a feel for how their everyday decisions are having an impact on the environment and the carbon emission, climate change. So it's making them feel that impact through their score and through, putting in their individual decisions, purchasing decisions that they're thinking about making, and getting feedback through this app or function.
So I would just to follow up one more thing. Tell us, how do we know when this campaign has succeeded? When we have changed people's, perception on how to do this? At what point have we been like, oh wait, this was really successful. This emerged and spread across this community that we care about?
Yeah, I guess you'll have to develop. You'll have the starting cumulative score of everyone, and you'll be able to see, is it moving in the right direction? Are people using it, commenting on it?
Right. So probably the correlation side of this is you look at who checks their score often and whether that score rises or drops, right? So there's the fun thing about norms-based change is that there's so much that can go wrong, right? So have any of you guys heard about rolling coal?
Yes.
This is this phenomenon where people are tricking out diesel trucks so that they can flip a switch and put out huge clouds of unburnt diesel exhaust. And this is a way in which people are sort of visibly signaling a giant to the environmental movement. And so the encouraged behavior is to roll up next to a Prius and then, basically show how useless your gesture is because someone is going to immediately put out enough exhaust gases to overcome you for the
have your video year. And have your buddy behind you videotape this.
Right. So there's a whole YouTube phenomenon of this. So there's a funny sense in which you could actually imagine people competing to increase rather than decrease scores. But where I do think you're right is that so much of this is in fact social signaling. So I'm going to go home to Western Massachusetts tonight. I'm actually going to flip the switch on my rooftop solar panels. I would like to tell you that I put up rooftop solar panels because I know that they're going to pay for themselves over the course of 5 years, which is a market and a legal-based theory of change because the law and the tax structure has made it possible for me to do it. But I'm really doing it out of social signaling. Like, my neighbors will look and see the solar panels on my house, and they will say, yeah, okay, at least he's doing the right thing. And when I bought my VW diesel Jetta that I'm going to drive back across the state on, that was because I thought I was doing the right thing and reducing. I only found out after the fact, and this was a bad code theory of change, that I was in fact doing the wrong thing. So I do think social signals are super powerful within this. The trick for a norms-based theory is that you can't impose social signals on people arbitrarily because they'll hate you for it and they'll ignore it. And so if Facebook suddenly decides we're just going to impose this on everybody, it's going to be on everyone's page, they're going to loathe it. The people who are going to adopt it first are the people who think that what they're doing is getting a low score and getting lower scores over time. The one place where I can imagine this going badly wrong is discovering that a lot of small environmental actions basically are insignificant. Like, a lot of the studies that people have done in recycling basically demonstrate that most recycling doesn't actually give you any net gain in terms of energy. It costs as much energy as it does otherwise. And I think for some of this, you might actually end up with people sort of going, geez, you know, I made all these changes, I got a Prius, and I only went down 2 points out of my 1,000. All that said, I think it's super interesting. I think Erhardt's right. I think it's at least as much a code solution as anything else. With the code folks as well, what you're basically doing is speculating that if you added this information to the system, it would change that normative behavior. The norms change is really this behavior that sort of says, it is a cool and desirable thing to have as low a number as possible, and optimizing my low number in the same way that I try to optimize my Fitbit step count is a desirable thing to do, and that's really cool.
Just by knowing what a contribution each of the products and habits you have for you, that would be a good incentive for norm change, because then I relax and, well, I can do this because this is not that bad, and I'm definitely going to stop doing this.
But it's a code change taking you to a norms change. That information right now is very hard to accomplish, and then the hope is a norms change comes right here. One simple, concrete example on it. A good friend of mine is working on a startup that calculates what the power mix is of the energy that you're using at any particular time. So right now, because it's dark outside, your power mix includes 0% solar, and it probably includes significantly more coal or natural gas. Whereas at high noon, it's got a significantly higher percent of solar, and it might have a different level of wind. By having an app that gives you that information, you can decide to run a very power-intensive process like aluminum anodizing at a time where you're using green power, or at a time when you're using cheap power. So by adding that information to it, you may well have a normative change that comes out of it that simply wouldn't have been possible until you had it. But that's the ways in which these things have been reinforcing. Erhardt, bring us home.
Well, we're out of time, which is probably why you're walking over here slowly with that look on your face. But
the fact that we're out of time is a very positive statement.
Yeah.
So let me bring us out and simply say, this sort of thinking and this way of sort of looking at social change through multiple levers and reinforcement, this is what we do. Like your group over here, we run a pretty open lab. Thursdays, 1:30, up on the 3rd floor of the MIT Media Lab. We have open lab meetings from 1:30 to 3. It's every Thursday except the first Thursday of the month. The first Thursday of the month, I hang out with these guys one-on-one. But come by, come talk with us. We'd love to keep engaging with you on this, particularly on these questions of how do you model and how do you understand the really complex dynamics around it. Thank you all for being terrific hosts for us. It's been really fun to be here.
And if one of you does win that Powerball jackpot with the tickets that we hand out,
please let us know.
We'll come all back together and we'll go through this exercise again.
Thank you everyone for coming. There is pizza outside, so you can have some. And let me just say,
sorry, no pizza for all of you.
It's been very great pleasure
Probably
to
been
have
eating dinner where you are.
visitors here today to show us what they say.
Thanks
but
for all
also
the
what
Twitter
they
comments.
do, because the
And there will be
engagement
notes
of the
posted
group is
to the
very
next emailing
positive
list
and really
within
part of how
the next day.
The change really will happen.
Okay, bye.
I will.
Thursday.
1:30 to 3.